Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and today I'm joined by Merkelchen, who is the CEO of the largest corporation in Goonswarm Federation, Karma Fleet, and also a member of CSM 14. And you've just come back from the first CSM Summit of that CSM, is that right?
That is right. Yeah, it's been about 2 weeks since we got back from beautiful Reykjavik.
Okay, and I understand that you can't go into a great deal of detail about it until the minutes come out and you know exactly what's NDA'd and what isn't. But I have a couple of questions that I can ask. And the first one is just that from what we saw publicly, it seems like you spent a lot of time with Hilmar and talking directly with Hilmar. Can you just give us some idea of what that was like and how your interactions with him went, if you can?
Absolutely. I think that's a fair assessment. I've been a part of the CSM. I was on CSM 13 as well. So I'm about 18 months into the CSM. And I don't think anyone would mind me saying that I've probably seen a lot more of Hilmar in the beginning of this term than I did in most of the rest of my time combined, which, for better or for worse, I know there's a ton of variance in opinion there, whether, the CEO of a company should be involved in the day-to-day ruminations of their digital products or whatever, but I don't really have any take on that, any kind of hot take or anything controversial to say. He's really nice fellow. He's got a lot of interesting things to say, and we were fortunate enough to get plenty of time to sit and talk about things with him. I'm sure everybody saw his tweet that he fired off, I think, when we were out at dinner one night about the Titans coming to EVE Online soon, trademark.
Yeah, hopefully that is just a joke.
I wouldn't know. You never know. In the chaos era of Eve Online, there are things that I suppose you would have never suspected you'd see coming to Eve, and then here they are landing on your lap with things like the blackout and the Sino changes and stuff like that. Although I imagine if he had true intention to do something crazy like the Titan, you probably wouldn't be reading about it on Twitter first.
Yeah, I imagine the Chaos era took up a significant portion of your time at that summit, at least knowing what previous ones were like. But something that's been in kind of the public conversation is the question of when the CSM knew what was happening. And there's always been, there's always going to be accusations of leaks and collusion and stuff like that within the CSM, just due to its somewhat storied past in regards to that. So can you clarify a little bit about when the CSM was informed about the blackout, or when it was, sorry, when you were informed about that it was ending?
Sure. Yeah. I think with let me talk about, if you don't mind, the summits just for 1 second, just to kind of
Sure.
back up and frame this for people just a little bit. I think a lot of people imagine that when you're on the CSM, you get off the airplane in Keflavik, you're whisked away to Reykjavik to CCP headquarters. You're pulled into a room. You're given, a plug to plug in your PowerPoint presentation, and you begin your new job as CSM, lead game designer for EVE Online, and you get to tell the developers this is what we would like you to work on, etc. That's obviously very, very far from the truth, and Jin, you know that very well yourself. More often than not, you're sort of in the role of focus group. You're just sort of the teams are telling you, hey, this is what we're working on. This is what we're thinking about doing. These are the things that we're exploring doing. What are your thoughts on this? You see any holes in it, positives, negatives, whatever? Just super candid, open feedback and discussion. And that's sort of been, as far as I understand it, dating back to the beginning of the CSM, how things have played out. So this time was a little bit different. You had the chaos era sort of playing out right in front of our eyes. Hilmar has been really, really public, I should say, like with FanFest at home, some of the things that he was, when he was doing that segment with Berger and they were sitting there on the rocking chairs and talking, I felt like he was kind of letting you see the soft underbelly of CCP and EVE Online as he saw it, and like I said earlier, for better or for worse, people are all over that spectrum on how they feel about hearing Hurricane Hilmar say all those things. But, for me, I like honesty and I like to hear what's really happening between people's ears. So I certainly didn't mind it. So you fast forward to this particular summit. We kind of walk in there in the middle of the chaos era while things are still up in the air and going crazy. And, if you were to look on, the Eve subreddit or something like that, you would be led to believe that the sky was falling. I don't know if such was ever really the case, but I think they did a decent job of trying to let the CSM experience the chaos just like everybody else. So you can sort of extrapolate that to mean whatever you would suppose it does. But we were caught up in the chaos as well. I'll say that.
So something that's always going to be on the top of my mind is just wondering if you felt that the summit was productive, if you felt like there was, a reasonable exchange of information and that CCP was open to absorbing information from the summit. Do you think that was the case?
I do think that was the case, and I think if I didn't believe that my time was well spent, I would not have run for a second term. It was really difficult to convince my family that I was going to be spending an additional 2 weeks a year away from them at significant expense of both time and money to make that happen. So, Jen, I don't know if you remember my first summit. I think we got to like Tuesday, and I had sort of hit the CSM wall where that. The reality that I wasn't there to tell people what I thought they should be doing with the game so much as listening to what people were telling me they were going to be doing with the game and providing more of a reactive feedback instead of proactive. And I'll never forget, we walked back to our hotel room. I think it was Tuesday night or something like that. I was super bummed out. And the older CSM reps try, and Jen, you've heard this as well, they try really hard to help the newer CSMs have reasonable expectations, but for one reason or another, until you really get there and you see how complicated it is to make the sausage, your imagination sort of runs wild with what you expect to play out while you're there. So I went back to my hotel room. I pulled up the Delta Airlines webpage. I started looking for flights home, and I'm like, I'm getting the hell out of here. I don't feel like my time is well spent. And a short 12 hours later, we're back in the meeting room at 9 a.m. and, things you actually start to see things click, and you see where these receptors come together and where ideas start to create tangible end results, and you start to feel like an important part of the process. And I don't know why. I guess I'm just a pretty emotional person, so it hit me particularly hard in a way that I don't know it necessarily strikes everyone. Actual results vary, I suppose, with regard to the personality of the person experiencing a CSM Summit, but this one was no different. You sort of get there, you're sizing things up for a day or two, you're having lots and lots of conversations, lots and lots of meetings, lots and lots of cold ones after hours with our friends from CCP, and things just sort of work out. And by the time you're in Tuesday, Wednesday, you've kind of hit your stride. You feel like you have a good grasp of what the company is intending to do, at least what they've revealed that they're intending to do. And you sort of find your place in it. And if you feel like there's opportunities to provide actionable feedback, things that they can actually do to make the deliverables even better than what they're anticipating, you make those little touches when and where appropriate, and just hope that whatever it is that ships at the end of the day works out being something that people enjoy.
Yeah, I think something that a lot of people who have never been on the CSM don't really understand is just how time limited you are when you're in the room talking to CCP. Like, you're going to have an hour, like CCP is going to spend 20 minutes pitching an idea to you, explaining it, and then you have like 40 minutes left of that hour to try and figure out what's wrong with that idea, what's broken about it. Yeah, I think people have very unrealistic expectations there sometimes.
Well, and Eve is a game with so many layers that I'm always amazed that you can sit and talk about something and you can be on minute 57 of a discussion about something that's just incredibly complex and nuanced, and someone uncovers some detail, some nugget of information, and you're like, holy crap, I cannot believe we didn't think of that already. And that has a major effect on this entire conversation we've just been having. And even with a room where you've got 10 players in there, and in a typical CSM, those 10 players probably represent 75 years or more of EVE Online experience together. And there's always something, right? It's a game that the people who love it love the complexity of it, and that means that when you're getting into the nitty gritty, people always joke like, if we're going to remove control towers, then Jita local is going to break. That intermeshing of this old vestigial code in a 16-year-old game. That's real, man. And you get into that stuff and you start trying to pull those things apart and suss things out one way or another, and it's amazing how intertwined everything can be, and how it requires an immense amount of consideration in game design.
So, one of the few, I suppose, benefits of these being on the CSM, especially now that we don't really have the same view on the roadmap that we used to, thanks to Seagull and other members of the executive branch of CCP, is that you have some idea of where EVE Online is going in a more longer term. But, that's been one of my concerns over the past couple of months. So I just want to ask you, do you feel like CCP has a vision for EVE, where they want it to go?
I do. I'll take you back to something that happened during your and I's last term. I'm sure you remember, and Eve players have heard a pretty extensive amount about this be publicly disclosed, so I don't worry about relaying this information. You're talking about something like high psych Wardex, right? And you're sitting and having a discussion about it. You're discussing mechanically, what does it look like? What does it mean? What do we see as opportunities to improve it? And then the data starts to come in, right? You've got really smart people that are producing, I don't know, their SQL reports or what the hell it is. I'm not good with that kind of stuff, but you're looking at these bar graphs and pie charts, and you're seeing, okay, this is how this game mechanic actually affects the sandbox, and this is what happens to it. And the CSM minutes that were released pretty accurately portrayed and reflected that the CSM sat mouths agape, stunned, looking at this information and thinking, dear Lord, this is a mechanic that someone needs to really pay attention to. So I don't know if that sort of predicated the era of game design that we find ourselves. I don't know exactly how those two things are playing out together, but I think that they're looking at a lot of information. And, if you, I don't want to use Chernobyl as an analogy, I think that may be a bad one, but you imagine you're standing in that nuclear reactor control room and you've got all these dials around you and they're all indicating different things. And I feel like CCP has a good eye on that particular type of information right now, and they're using a lot of data-driven approaches to assess things. They said the blackout was going to be something we're doing as sort of an experiment in the sandbox. We'll see what happens with it. Clearly, what they read on the indicators told them, hey, let's walk this back. Maybe there's something further coming with the blackout at some point. Hilmar and those guys are probably the only people that really know that, but I think they are paying attention to what's going on. And like I mentioned earlier, with a 16-year-old game, you're probably in a place where you're at least if I was in that situation, if that was a company that I was working for, I'd be thinking, okay, it's been a good run, but we need to do something to shake this game up. And I can't think that there were immense segments of the player base that were perfectly satisfied. There were still lots of people playing EVE, but there weren't quite as many as there probably could have been. So I know there's a lot of attention on that. You heard Hilmar talk about paying attention to the new players, paying attention to the subsequent logins after the first time they play, paying attention to the first week or the first month or the first interaction with a real human being and how it goes. Their first experience of loss and what that does to a person. People running a certain mission that's like notoriously difficult and hard, and what that does to a player, a new player of the game. So they're focusing lots on that stuff. There's no secret there. I think that's a great idea. I don't think EVE Online is ever going to be a game that's quite like World of Warcraft or something like that, where it's for almost everybody, because of that complexity that we were talking about earlier. It's a really complex game, but I do think there are a lot of things that they can do on their end to sort of dull some of the sharp corners that people run into when they start playing the game. So I feel pretty good about it. They've got some really smart, talented people working on it. I think now it's just a matter of them figuring out, okay, which indicator, which dial are we going to focus on now? What result do we want to get from any change that we may be making? And then, program in something appropriate that gets you the result that you're looking for, hopefully. So I'm confident. I wouldn't be going back if I didn't think that we were in a good place or we were sailing off a cliff like Thelma and Louise or something like that. I think it's going to be fine.
Okay. Well, I paid, as you might imagine, pretty close attention to a lot of the other CSM's interviews or podcast appearances as they came off the summit. One of the things that really stood out to me was Philly's appearance on the Meta show, where I think one of the few things that he was actually willing to say was simply, it was good that we were there, and as someone with a lot of experience on the CSM, that's generally code for CCP presented something we heavily disagreed with. Is there anything there that you could talk about, or at least agree? Do you agree with that sentiment? I guess is what I'm trying to get at here.
I would say the same thing. I would say I was really, really glad that we were there. For two reasons, I guess. If you've ever heard Anominate talk about his experience on the CSM, he's a person that would say, if we ever got to write a book about this one day, or we ever got to just do like a no holds barred interview, the things that didn't happen to EVE Online are sometimes more interesting than the things that did, right? Because when you've got 200 people working on a game, right, trying to figure out what are we going to do with this 16-year-old game, obviously some crazy stuff can come to the forefront, because obviously you want all options to be on the table. So I don't know precisely what Billy would be referring to when he says something like that, but I walked away from it, and that's a week where, you know how I do things, Jin. I probably sleep 10 hours that entire week if I'm lucky. It's a really, really hard burning. I take about a decade off of my life every time I spend a week in Reykjavik, but I felt like the time was very, very well spent. I felt like we got the job done. This was a little more... this was different. It was kind of a different CSM. In previous years, the CSM kind of walks lockstep together and comes up with, points of consensus or points of contention, and we try to really deliberately communicate that. I think this year, the minutes will reflect that we sort of went in just with an anything goes. Let's see what happens. We're in the chaos era right now, so we're just going to see what CCP is doing and then go from there. A lot of interesting personalities in the group this year. Not that there weren't in previous years. We've always had really, really great and talented people involved. But yeah, I would say I completely agree with what Billy said, but not for any reason nefarious or otherwise. This was just business as usual and getting the job done.
Yeah, I will say that just on that vein, one of the worst parts of the CSM that people don't really see is just watching really good ideas just die on the operating table as a CSM member.
Yeah, you sort of hate to see some of that stuff get cut real early on the vine. But I guess it comes with the territory. I don't have a background in programming or video game design, and I think the people that do have significantly more realistic expectations, right? If you're pitching something to CCP, for instance, or they're pitching something to you and you're trying to come to some kind of consensus on what the final product is going to look like, everybody knows this is just common sense that if what you're asking them to do is take 2 power grid away from some ship, well, that's a pretty easy game design change, right? Somebody goes into a line of code somewhere, deletes something, deletes a 2 and puts a 4 or whatever. Whereas anything that's like, all right, I've got this idea. I want to create this complex new system that intermingles with a dozen existing systems. Those are going to be a lot more difficult. And, in that second example, many of those ideas are wonderful and they have a point and a place and they have, an end result that I think would be very, very good for the health health of the game and the benefit of the players, but it's not all realistic. There's only so many developers, there's only so many designers, there's only so many programmers, and you can't just pivot these big giant teams. They don't necessarily have super high agility, right? They do establish inertia, they do establish momentum, but they can't pivot extremely quickly, just by virtue of how complex the work is.
All right, well, thank you for your time. I just have one final question, and that's just to ask you, what can people who aren't on the CSM do to help the CSM, or to help the health of the game overall?
That's a wonderful question. You know me personally, I'm a really positive person, or at least I'd like to think that I am. I try to put that out into the universe in the hopes that it will bring positive things back to me. This is more just ruminations on life and how things work, but extrapolate that to EVE Online. I know that there's significant segments of the player base that may be disenfranchised. They may be thinking, you know what, this change was the last straw. I can't take it anymore. This one thing that was dialed in, that's it. I've heard that 1,000 times in the time that I've played Eve. I don't think we should get too caught up in that stuff. I don't think that anyone that's doing anything to EVE Online up in Reykjavik is doing it to piss you off necessarily. There are certainly, and CCP will admit this, they make missteps all the times. There's things they wish they could walk back and do a different way. There's things that they have neglected that I'm sure they wish they paid more attention to. But it's just a company that's run by people. So what I would advise the players to do, if you're interested in the long-term health of the game, keep plugging away, keep doing the things that make there be fun for you. I don't know. It just seems kind of silly to tie yourself to like, oh, this bullet point on the roadmap or on the dev release. This was the last straw for me. I don't know. When I'm talking to my people in my corporation or my alliance, I always try to tell them, just withdraw your emotions from this one particular change. EVE Online is sort of the canvas that we all participate in together. It's the fabric of these wonderful social groups that we're all a part of. And if when you log into Eve and you hit the undock button and you get out there with your friends and you're having a nice time, if it's fun for you, if it's rewarding for you, then just keep doing it, right? I don't like to dignify the Eve subreddit with comment too much because it gets to be a pretty repulsive place. But these kind of thread knots about just like, screw these people, they're stupid, you're all stupid, and just the general toxicity of the entire thing, I think is harmful. I think it's probably a byproduct of just the human condition and how difficult life is on this planet these days. But something that I at least try to focus on, I try to focus me and my friends on, is we're enjoying each other. We're having a nice time together. We should continue to do that. So I don't know. I don't know if I even answered your question. I just think that the negativity doesn't really help anybody. If you've got a meaningful idea for something that could be done to the game to make it better, this is the era of thread knots, right? Go ahead and throw one up to let people sound off about it, see what people think about it. And you never know. It may be the next bullet point on one of those dev releases or something like that. But let's try to pull some of this negative emotion out of the entire thing. It's so easy to be negative and to be a troll and to be a freaking contrarian or some lowbrow simpleton asshole, and that's just too easy. I don't have time for that stuff. I don't think CCP has a ton of time for that stuff. So if you've got a reasonable argument to make, or you've got a point that you feel like is wonderful that you'd like to make, I think if you do so in a way that is reasonable and respectful, you're going to receive the same things back from those guys. And that's probably an advisable pathway forward for people.
All right, well, thank you for spending the time to talk to me. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make before we close out this interview?
No, dude, I really appreciate you having me on. Missed having you around this year. Obviously, I'm just super glad we got a chance to get together today.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thank you for coming, and I hope to see you around.